They've been called the ghost ships of the Wiscasset. It's been said that they were once the most photographed ships in the world. Whatever you want to call them, out of the over 500 built, the Hesper and Luther Little were the very last of the 4-masted wooden ships that once sailed the coastal waters of North America. This is the story of two sister ships built in the same yard and launched within a few months of each other, who sailed very different careers but for the same owner, and were ultimately reunited for their long, drawn-out fates on the shores of Maine. The true history of these ships is becoming mythology and lore. In researching for this video, I found conflicting newspaper articles about what shipyards built them. I found heated debates over their namesakes, or why the ships ultimately ended up abandoned. I found arguments over which ship was actually which, printed in the newspapers. For this video, we're going back to the original source material. We're meeting with some of the people who were involved in an effort to peel back the confusion and go back to the original facts. To help with this, I'm visiting the Wiscasset Public Library, which also happens to be the oldest continuously circulating library in the United States, and they've shared their extensive archive on these vessels with me. To tell their stories right, we need to start off by looking at each ship individually. The older of the two ships is the Luther Little, the schooner that sat closest to the shore. The Luther Little was built by the Reed Brothers Shipyard in Somerset, Massachusetts, and designed by Bowden, Crown & Shield, whose firm, Crown & Shield Shipbuilding, took over the yard before the ships were launched. Placing the order was a shipping company out of Boston named Rogers & Webb, and they also ordered the Hesper. The Luther Little was actually the second construction by that name. You see, the Reed Brothers Shipyard suffered a major fire that took out the majority of the yard, as well as the Luther Little, still in construction, on the stocks. And then the ship needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. This new ship was launched fully rigged on December 17, 1917. She was 202 feet long and 40 feet across, registering 1,224 tons. The hold was nearly 20 feet deep and could hold a shipment of around 2,000 tons of coal, while the accommodations inside for the crew were quite lavish and comfortable, particularly those of the captains. Whom the ship drew its name from is a bit of a debate. One argument that I actually saw in a 1917 newspaper covering the launch of the ship is that the Luther Little was named for Luther Little, a steel magnate out of New York. Another theory that I've heard more often, which I honestly think is more likely, is that it was named for the Revolutionary War hero, Luther Little. He was a midshipman aboard the American ship Protector, and he was wounded in battle against the British warship Admiral Duff, although he survived his wounds and actually later went on to become an American privateer. The Luther Little's first captain was W.P. Richardson, who sailed her on voyages up and down the East Coast, often aiding tangentially in the efforts of the First World War. Now, speaking of tangents, it was a hot summer day in June of 1918 when two balloonists, Arthur Houghton and Edward Packard, took off in a balloon from the Naval Air Station at Cape May, New Jersey. They floated across the bay and drifted down to Delaware when they began to lose altitude. Now, it's a balloon, you can't really steer, you're at the mercy of the wind, and they ended up being pushed out over the Atlantic Ocean as they dropped further and further. Those same winds that pushed the balloon dangerously over the ocean were also pushing the Luther Little along the same shore. Captain Richardson spotted the falling balloon and ordered his ship to pursue it. The balloon crashed into the sea, but the Luther Little was there just in the nick of time to save both balloonists and recover their balloon. Although I've heard that the Luther Little did cross the Atlantic, I can't confirm this. The farthest port of call that I can actually find is in South America. And then in 1920, she sailed for Haiti, where she was overloaded with logwood bound for Chester, Pennsylvania, and couldn't clear the harbor. She grounded for 2 weeks as the crew tried to free the ship, finally becoming unstuck without any significant damage. As the mid-1920s approached, Rogers and Webb hit some hard financial times, and by 1925 the Luther Little was laid up in Portland, Maine. It's here that her story would reunite with her sister, the Hesper. The Hesper was the larger of the two, though not by much, and was the schooner that sat farther from the shore. She was ordered around the same time as the Luther Little and built by the same shipyard. Now, the Luther Little cost somewhere around $125,000 to build. So the Hesper was probably a little bit more than that, being the larger of the two vessels. Once completed, she was 210 feet long, 41 feet across, and registered 1,348 tons. Her launch was advertised for July 4th and actually had quite a turnout. She was christened and sent soaring down the slipway towards the water. The rudder splashed, and then that was it. She sat there. What actually happened was the ship was so heavy and the slipway was a little on the cheaper side, so it collapsed under the weight and the Hesper was stuck there. Now, an old-time sailor might call that a bad omen, and they might be on to something, for although the career of the Hesper was not terrible, it wasn't that great. In 1920, the first mishap struck. She left Norfolk, Virginia, carrying a full load of coal bound for Boston. As she rounded Massachusetts, a harsh storm whipped up, tore her sails to pieces, and tossed her out to sea. She limped into Portland, Maine, and was stuck there until she could be repaired. On 2 occasions early in her career, the ship sailed to Lisbon, Portugal with coal, and then down to Venezuela to pick up guano to bring back to the States. For at least part of her career, the ship was under the command of a Captain Haskell, who was described by his crew as a mean old stinker. He overworked the men and overworked the ship. On at least one occasion, one of his crewmen grabbed a gun and took shots at him. They missed, and the crewman was arrested. In 1925, while leaving Boston, the ship's anchor fouled in the mud, and a lighter was needed to free her. A month later, on the return trip entering Boston, the ship grounded, and 9 tugs were needed to free her. In 1928, due to the financial difficulties of Rogers and Webb, resulting from the decreasing demand for sailing ships, the Hesper was laid up in Rockport, Maine. In that same year, a terrible winter storm ripped through Rockport, not only tearing the ship from its moorings, but sending the ship clean through its wharf, tearing the wharf to pieces. The ship was then washed up on the beach. It needed to be freed and damages were slight, but although the ship was sitting idly, it was still costing the company money. After that, the ship was towed down to Portland, where she joined her sister in layup. In 1932, a U.S. Marshal auctioned off company assets from Rogers and Webb in order to settle claims against them, including the Hesper and the Luther Little. They were bought by a man from Auburn, Maine, named Frank W. Winter. He bought the Hesper for $600 and the Luther Little for $525. From there, he towed them up to Wiscasset, Maine. Shortly after the American Revolution, back in the days of the original Luther Little, Wiscasset was one of the leading harbors and shipbuilders in all of Maine. Although that era had long passed by 1932, the arrival of the 2 large schooners was a real treat for the town. The reason Frank bought these ships and brought them here was simple, but ambitious. He got a little carried away playing Railroad Tycoon 2 and had recently acquired the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington Railway, a narrow-gauge railroad that ran from the wharves of Wiscasset up into Maine through various towns and logging camps, some of which he had an interest in. Frank intended to use the railroad to haul lumber down from these logging camps down to Wiscasset and load them aboard the Hesper and the Luther Little. They would sail them into Portland, and then another railroad would haul that lumber off. On the return trip, they'd bring in a shipment of coal for his railroad and mills. It was a straightforward enough plan, but the logistics simply didn't work out. On June 15, 1932, while Frank was struggling to get his plans off the ground, one of his locomotives, number 8, derailed, blocking his track completely. It's rumored that he went broke over this derailment and had to give up his plans, but that doesn't seem to be the case. The dude was loaded. He didn't go broke over a simple derailment. He seems to have simply given up out of frustration. The railroad, which was being run by a friend of his, was failing, and his logging camps were running out of wood to haul. He gave up on his plans within only a few days of buying the 2 ships, but still in September of 1932, he towed them into Wiscasset without any real plans for them because he had to put them somewhere. For the first few years, they were at anchor offshore. He had a captain and his family living aboard the Luther Little, and 2 maintenance workers, a father and son duo, living aboard the Hesper, to keep the ships ready should he decide to do something with them. He attempted to sell the ships off several times, but he claimed that the government blocked the sale every time. On one occasion, he had a very eager buyer with cash in hand from St. John, New Brunswick, but the sale was once again blocked. He never found out why. Eventually, he just gave up in frustration. When he finally did give up for good, sometime between 1936 and 1940, the steam winches were fired up on both ships for one last time, and they were used to pull the ships closer to the shore and become beached in the mud. Here they'd stay, Luther Little being the closest to land, and Hesper nearly leaning into her. The machinery was then removed, and the ships were stripped of anything of value or use. Around that same time, the masts of the Hesper were deemed a safety hazard and were cut down, but the masts of the Luther Little would remain standing almost until the very end. The coming decades were not kind to these ships.
Yeah, I think it was VE Day. Some miscreants set them afire in celebration, and the back decks of a couple of them kind of burned down, collapsed. They got the fire out.
The pilings we see along the waterfront are the posts of the old narrow gauge railroad wharves.
It was a narrow gauge railroad. It ran right through just about where we're standing. The pilings you see right behind me at Union Wharf, one of them leaned up against the end of it, and the other one was inside of it and back here and just back of it a little bit, or beside it.
The rail line had been coming through here for decades prior to the arrival of the Hesper and the Luther Little, with both passenger and freight services, but the wharf activity was expanded in vain under Frank Winter.
The water was at the bank of the railroad almost. The wharves here were built where previous wharfs were.
So we're not going to see much laying around here, but we can see the remains of a lot of the wharves that the Hesper and Luther were leaning against. Interestingly, we do actually see something. Now, I can't guarantee it's actually from the Hesper or the Luther, but it's worth pointing out. You see, the 2 ships, as we know, were coal carriers at one point in their career, and there's a whole bunch of chunks of coal along here. There is, of course, a railroad going to my right, and it's possible that it came from there. It's possible it came from somewhere completely different, but there's always a chance that that's just some remains of the coal that was once on board the Hesper and the Luther. We do know that when the 2 ships were towed into Wiscasset, there were still a few tons of coal down in their holds. Here's where one of the biggest inaccuracies has crept into the usual common telling of this tale. It's said that the ships were abandoned in 1936 as a result of Frank Winter's death. But Frank Winter didn't die in 1936. He actually lived almost another 30 years, dying at the ripe old age of 102. He simply left them there all this time, not having a plan for them and not being able to sell them. He died in 1965. Around that time, the Wiscasset Industrial Development Committee was formed with plans to preserve the history of the town's waterfront. They bought the 2 ships from the Frank Winter estate. The fire back in 1945 damaged the Hesper too greatly, but the committee was considering restoring the Luther Little and turning it into a tourist attraction. The ships were already becoming iconic, symbolizing a lost era of shipbuilding. Despite their neglect, the Hesper and Luther Little were now the last remaining 4 masted schooners in the world, and the importance of their preservation grew. They did fall apart over the years, but despite that, nobody wanted them removed. These derelict vessels had now been woven into the fabric of the town. Musician Gordon Bach even wrote a song about the 2 ships, and they became a cultural icon.
You were solid built of Douglas fir and oak and yellow pine, 200 feet sailed by a crew that numbered only 9, loading lumber through your timber ports and dyewood from the south, running home from Norfolk bearing coal to heat the north
It's said that tens of thousands of photographs were taken of the Hesper and the Luther Little over the decades, with some even claiming that they were the most photographed ships in the whole world.
The only one that ever made any money off them was Eastman Kodak.
Legends sprung up around the ships and the history became muddled. As they became known as the ghost ships of Wiscasset, they also became a popular place for kids to go hang out and play, with them jumping aboard and climbing below decks, or going up the masts and falling and breaking a leg.
One of the things to do was climb the ratlines and tie a hanky to the top of the mast. Not advised, and don't get caught, but some did it.
Did you ever do it?
I would never admit it.
So there's sort of a tradition that we had, some of us local hooligans. We would sort of try to light the ships on fire every 4th of July. Not in a really destructive way, we just wanted to see if we could actually huck something all the way out from the railroad tracks all the way onto the deck. And of course, if something happened to actually catch fire and burn a little bit, it was terribly exciting. I don't think we really thought about what we were doing, and I think it's certainly pretty sad when we realized that it was ultimately a fire that really took them down beyond repair.
A fire did break out aboard the Hesper on July 4th in 1978. This put the Hesper, which was already in bad shape, into rapid decline. The fire inspired the town to organize a preservation group called the Friends of the Wiscasset Schooners. They raised enough funds to conduct an expensive survey of the ship. It cost $18,000 around 1980. And the surveys concluded that both ships were too far gone to save. And then the efforts of the preservation group died off almost instantly. Another fire broke out in 1980, and by then the Luther Little's masts were leaning precariously, putting additional strain on the structure and making the ships all the more unsafe. Believe it or not, an earthquake struck the area and took out the Luther Little's aft mast. In 1991, a fire broke out aboard the Luther Little after someone shot a flare gun at it. Eventually, it became less of a question of how to save these schooners and more so what to save from them. A storm battered the ships in 1995, taking out the last of the Luther's masts. The ships were in bad shape at that time, but believe it or not, there was one final hope to preserve them in the current state that they were in.
There was a chance that we could have got a federal grant here and some state money as well to do a mitigation on the rot in the ships and do some preservation work. And the town did go to a vote on whether or not to do that work because it would have been some town expense as well. And the town of Wiscasset citizens decided to not go forward with the project.
The Hesper completely collapsed on itself, and it was finally decided that the ships needed to be demolished and removed. This happened in the spring of 1998.
A contractor from Poland, General Marine, got the job to pull them out. They came in with a big barge and a 100-ton crane with a lot of boom on it, some other things, and they just started picking the pieces out with a clamshell and putting it in the barge, and then they would swing it ashore and pile the what I dug out right here. That was above high water was getting rotten. That was below high water was as solid as the day it was built. And they came apart very hard when we rode them. When we hauled them out, anybody that wanted anything could pick out of the pile of stuff that came here.
They kind of just put them in a local dump, which was pretty sad for a lot of us. My folks went out on an adventure, as a lot of the local townies did, and just got some pieces and brought them home because it's a part of us. It's always been a part of us. So when they brought this piece home, and you can kind of rarely see up top, it has a wooden peg in it. We don't know what part of the ship this would be. Presumably some exterior part. It's very weathered. It's a large beam from either the Hesper or the Luther Little. We have no way to tell which one.
Whatever was left was hauled away to the dump, although the dump continued dispersing pieces of the ship to collectors over time. In 2005, the Maine Maritime Museum in Bath was able to haul away some large pieces of the ship. The museum is built around what was once the Percy and Small shipyard, which built massive schooners such as the Wyoming, a wreck that I've covered on this channel. In their blacksmith shop, you would find the largest portion of the Luther Little that still exists, at least to my knowledge. This giant section of the Luther Little's foremast is known as the doubling. You'll notice that the masts of the ship are actually two segments, and where they overlap is a large reinforcing piece known as a doubling. Heavy equipment and rigging are still mounted to it, giving us a sense of scale of these enormous vessels. The museum also features a beautiful scale model of the Hesper and the Luther Little when they were at Wiscasset, and this model inspired me to first look into this story. The age of these massive old schooners is more gone than you realize. Now that the Hesper and the Luther Little have been completely demolished, this obliterated hulk right here holds the title of being the largest surviving wooden hull ship from the era, of course not counting the sunken ones. This is the Cora F. Cressy, built by Percy and Small in 1902, and occasional running mate of the old Wyoming. I've done a video about this ship on my channel as well. It should be noted that while the Hesper and the Luther Little were the last remaining four-masted schooners in the world, since they held that title in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, at least two modern four-masted schooners have been built, although these ones don't hold the same historical significance and they were never in the same service. Although the Hesper and Luther Little have long since vanished from the mud flats where they rested, their legacy remains. The town of Wiscasset still looks back fondly on the two vessels, even now hosting an event every summer called Schooner Fest. Historical markers, including an augmented reality display, can be found at the site. There they are. But not really. Remnants of the wharf are still there, and various pieces of equipment from the ship sit there in the grass as reminders.
The bollards, the bollards from the ships, the winchheads, capstans that were on the side of the deck house, this is one of them. There was one on each side.
The course these ships charted has finished, and the lines have become blurred. But hopefully this deep investigation into the original source material will help preserve their stories for future generations.
Now the people come and stare at you with wonder in their eyes. The times have changed since men knew how to work a ship your size. And the seas you sailed are running black. In time we'll know our loss. It's too late now for you, but is it too late now for us?
Can you teach us what you know before you go?
For the winter is upon you now, and time is passing slow, and the tides ebb and flow down below.
If you enjoyed this video and love learning about forgotten maritime history and exploration, consider subscribing to my channel and visiting my Patreon at the link below. A special thank you to my patrons, especially Marlo Perez, Kelly Black, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Kaiser Friedrich III, Zach Richards, Donald Anderson, Cody Henricks, Joan Haynes, Sean Kimball, Glenn Biddiscombe, Stephen Schwankert, Gabrielle Colombe, Nick K, RGB, Tara Molokar, Keith Holland, Miles Garrett, Jennifer, Rob M, Amos Mayhew, Corey Andrews, Nicholas Masella, Cole Tannick, Sophie Baber, Rob, Oliver Chinchen, John Miluski, David Watipka, Tiffany Raridan, Madtime Media, Nathan Gutierrez, Max Metcalf, David Littlejohn, Sean Sahi Fraser, Nikki Chan 92, Corbin McDonald, Matthew Burns, and Luke Stevens.